Welcome back to Book and Page. Okay, so we are on Chapter 4 of The Hobbit, which is called Over Hill and Under Hill, because mountains. Mountains are hills, apparently. Well, I suppose over hill and under hill is easier to say than over mountain and under mountain. Okay, so summary of events. The troop begins their mountain passage, but are caught in a bad thunderstorm, which makes them take shelter in an apparently empty cave. They relax. They start to unwind, but Bilbo actually catches sight of the goblins stealing their ponies, and thanks to his shouted warning, Gandalf gets away, despite everybody else being caught. The goblins sing about the violence that occurs in Goblin Town. Yay! As they drive the group further down, and meet the Great Goblin. And we are told, unfortunately, that we don't see the ponies again. So the ponies probably got eaten. Thorin tries, kinda, to talk their way out of it, as much as you could talk to the goblins, because apparently sometimes goblins and not nice dwarves work together, but not Thorin's type, because the Mines of Moria was a battle that happened that the goblins lost royally. And it is made worse, they're completely given away by the fact that that Thorin has the Goblin Cleaver, the Elvish sword. So they're all about to die, except Gandalf comes in, he somehow puts out all the lights, kills the Great Goblin, and they all make their initial escape, fighting when necessary, but mostly running, and Bilbo gets carried around and sort of tossed between dwarves, until, unfortunately, he's at the back of the pack and gets grabbed by a goblin and pulled off. And he disappears into the dark, and that's the end of the chapter. So, that's gotta be spooky for a kid. Just like, good night, Billy. No, Dad, come back. Bilbo's, a goblin's gonna grab me into the dark. No, come back. This poor Bilbo is just gone now, and you're like, oh, excellent. Okay, so, first big talking point here is actually a bunch of little talking points. So, Tolkien actually, throughout The Hobbit, and I found actually really particularly in this chapter, Tolkien has this tendency to plant little things that, if you're not careful, can go unnoticed. Because they're these small things, but you realize they have bigger implications as you're going through to theme, or the full story, or his greater world, or things like that. So I'm going to go a little rapid fire and hit on some of the points that I noticed in this chapter in particular. 1. Nature is terrifying. Like this thunderstorm that is a thunder battle that involves mountain golems throwing rocks at each other. That's frightening, and it has nothing to do with Bilbo or the dwarves or Gandalf. Nature seems almost at this point to actually be fighting itself. Like the lightning and thunder are sort of personified to the point where they seem to be fighting themselves, and then we have these mountains that are hitting each other, and our poor little group is just caught in the middle. And that's sort of interesting because there are a lot of people that make the argument that a return to nature is not the way to go because nature is amoral. It doesn't have this concept of picking the good over the bad, or the bad over the good. It doesn't make those moral choices because it's nature. It doesn't have the rational capacity to do that. It just does what it naturally does, and then good and bad people alike get hurt by it. Landslides kill people. Forest fires kill people and destroy property and kill people. Hurricanes and tornadoes and tsunamis and earthquakes kill people. And these are all parts of nature. So to say, well, we shouldn't build things, and we should return to nature, well, some people are like, that's terrifying. Because nature will kill you. And it's not because you made any choices. It is nothing to do with your actions. It is just an amoral, things happened and you're dead. So it's sort of interesting because Tolkien, when you read his work, definitely has an interest in nature. He loves describing it. You get creatures like the Ents in The Lord of the Rings. The elves are very nature-loving. So it's sort of interesting that he does point to these moments of utter, amoral, yet frightening aspects to nature that have to be taken as part of a natural account. And it doesn't matter our opinions of it. It is part of nature. Nature can be terrifying. So it's interesting because then we get in to the goblins and their technology, which is again an idea of controlling nature. So we're not getting the full idea of we need to control everything from Tolkien because of his opinions on the goblins, which we'll get to. So what type of balance are we looking for here? Because it's terrifying, but also people are terrifying. And I say people here and not humans. We're an analog, right? Because in his world, there's all these different races. They're not all humans. They're not all men, but they're all people. So people are terrifying because the goblins are an aspect of humans, just like the elves are an aspect of humans, and the hobbits and dwarves are aspects of humans, and Gandalf is an aspect of our humanity. So, nature's terrifying, but we are too. Like I said, we'll get to that point because it's later in the chapter, trying to do a little bit in chronological order. Looking and finding. Oh. I did that thing where I'm like, oh, I need to read this page, and then didn't find the page in advance. Because planning ahead. Okay, yeah. We get this lovely quote as they're caught in this battle about trying to find some safe place, and they've sent Philly and Killy ahead. And we get this lovely quote, there is nothing like looking if you want to find something. And then in brackets, or so Thorin said to the young dwarves when he sends them off. You certainly usually find something if you look, but it is not always quite the something you are after. So that is a very interesting, and again, very quiet, off to the side little comment about you gotta take action. You can't expect everything to fall into your lap, because if you do expect everything to fall into your lap, you're most likely going to be sitting there waiting as opportunities pass you by because you were not actively looking for those opportunities. You need to get involved in your own life, especially if you want to get somewhere specific. But it also, the second part of that comment is this realization that even if you work for something, you're not always going to get it. Or it's not always going to come to you in the way you thought it would, or it's not going to be the way you thought it would be. Like, you can work to get a certain job position, but it turns out maybe you don't get that job position, despite working for it. Or it turns out you don't like that job. You get the position, and you thought you were going to be doing one thing, and it turns out you're supposed to be doing something else, and you don't want to be doing that something else, you want to be doing this thing. So it's sort of this, get out and work for it, with the little asterisks of recognizing life isn't fair, and you can't control everything in life, just like you can't control nature. So we're seeing again this connection running through of control, and that you have to be able to roll with the punches. if you just shut down because it didn't work out exactly how you wanted it to or exactly how you planned, you're going to be shut down for most of your life. So you gotta work for it and aim for things, but recognize that you're not infallible, and you're going to have to make adjustments to what you're doing when you find out that you've found something different from what you were looking for. It all connects back to that want and need thing happening. And then finally, final small talking point is, what's with Gandalf? Did he just summon lightning? What are his powers? Who is he working for? How did he turn all the lights out? That's one of the sort of interesting things, is it's not, his powers aren't all based in light. We get this bright light, and several goblins that went for him dropped dead, which is where we get the report of them getting hit by lightning. But then in Goblin Town, he turns all the lights off, like he extinguishes all the lights. And then as they're running, his staff lights up. So he's got this ability to use both light and darkness as he needs to, which says that if Gandalf is good, then neither of those is inherently good or bad. Darkness isn't evil all the time. There is some use to it. But he's this weird character that you, in this book, what's with Gandalf? How are you just super powerful and kick ass at sword play and killing goblins, and what is going on? And there are canon explanations. He is this sort of weird little being, that he's not, like he was sent by, I'm not going to be able to pronounce the name of Tolkien's version of the gods, but the wizards are sent by the gods to basically shepherd the people, and there's 5 of them, and the 2 blues are off looking for adventure and glory, so you can already tell that the wizards aren't infallible themselves, and Saruman, the head of the order, is definitely prickly and warped and right off the deep end. And Radagast is off the deep end in a different way. So we have Gandalf, and Gandalf's just weird, but he speaks about being a servant to the Secret Fire in The Lord of the Rings. So I think that's important to mention because that divine aspect is going to come up in this conversation, not necessarily directly in The Hobbit, but certainly in my conversations of it as we go through. So Gandalf's just a weird character that just... Okay. And now the bigger topic to go along with all those smaller topics. I kicked myself for this one, because it is something that we have to talk about, especially with, as we've established, all the races are analogs for part of humans, and we can be terrifying. So let's talk about Goblin Techne. Now, Techne is a Greek word that originally, for the most part, meant craft and craftsman, and it's come often to describe technology. So it's the building of things that in modern senses also includes technology, but you also have to think that pretty much everything you see here is some sort of technology that's been crafted. My glasses are a form of technology that actually help me see properly. The chair I'm sitting on is a form of technology, especially since it does things like that. Now I'm sitting lower than I was expecting. So it's sort of this catch-all word now for the objects we make and use. And the people who make and use that technology. So Tolkien in this chapter sheds light on the goblins' crafting ability, and how it affects their other arts, such as the songs they sing. And he does this very specifically, starting with song, and then we actually get a written breakdown of what's actually happening here. So the goblins are crafters, not to create things, but to destroy other things. We're not crafting chairs so we could sit down and write poetry. If anything, they'd craft chairs so they could sit down while torturing another being. Specifically, they have an enjoyment of creating things that can be used for torture and destruction. And in fact, Tolkien says that historically we've maintained these terrible techne practices through modern war equipment. Both World War I, which Tolkien himself fought in, and World War II, which his son fought in. So that's a clear line that the goblins and orcs are part of us, and we don't always create for the sake of creation. We often create for the sake of destruction. And it's a question of how much our other media and art portrays that. Because the goblins only have one song, and it is specifically about pain and destruction and violence. And they all know it. It's a popular song, apparently. So it is this question of how much they glorify that. And that becomes a question for us of how much do we create for the sake of destruction and then glorify that destruction in some way. And war machines are the big thing that is pointed to, is alluded to. And then what's particularly interesting is then Tolkien connects the goblins and the dwarves. This is the moment he mentions that bad dwarves often work with the goblins. And again, considering that all these races are analogs for humanity and portions of humanity, and we have pointed to the greed of dwarves, that is a relationship then we need to be aware of in ourselves. When does greed become the reason for creating to destroy? When do those things start feeding into each other? Because I want to build something so that I can have the money and other people can't. I want to tear down all these low-income houses so I can build a mall. It's a relationship, and it's a very strong relationship, and Tolkien calls it out here through the use of the goblins and not good dwarves working together. And that's sort of another interesting thing, is the question then of, is there a type of greed or an amount of greed that is necessary without being necessarily destructive? Do we have a good dwarf part to us where greed leads to something creative for the sake of creativity and art and improvement of the world? I can think of a few right now. The greed of having enough food, not all of the food, but having enough food, because it's really weird to say it, but I think you could argue that's a part of, that's some sort of greed. And maybe it's because I want to take that food from the big corporations that don't need it, and the corporations that just gobble up everything and use it for myself and my family and my village and my town and my city. So it is a question of, can you define that as a type of greed, and is that a positive type of greed? Like, I want my village to have enough food, so I build and improve an irrigation system. Can you make that definition of, because I'm trying to feed my own, that I create something? It's even better if then you share that creation. So it is something, because we are getting this definition, a divide between good dwarves and bad dwarves. And it's the bad dwarves that are connected to the goblins and this destructive creative force. Especially since we do then have Thorn and his people previously having rejected the goblins rather than working with them. Even after they lost everything to Smaug. You think that that might be a turning point of starting to work with the goblins. But Thorn and his people reject them. So do we have a positive version of greed? Or maybe not defined as greed, but characteristics that are connected to greed that can be used in a positive manner. And is action what sets it apart? Is it the choice of action? Actually acting on it? Is it actively fighting against the goblins and not passively just ignoring them and not working with them? There are a couple places where you're trying to figure out where that line is drawn and how is that line drawn. And as always, I don't think there's easy answers to that. There's never going to be easy answers to trying to figure out human nature, or dwarven nature, or even goblin nature. How much of this is something they were born with versus what they were twisted into. That really plays up, especially when we get to the orcs in The Lord of the Rings, which we see being actively created by Saruman. So, okay, I'm sitting lower than I was before because of Techne, and I'm going to keep reading, and I hope you do too. See you next time.